All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, May 12th, and is Trump going to recognize Palestine as a state?
That I don't know. Yeah, there are rumors to that effect. But it seems like there is some kind of deal in the works. And what for me, the most interesting part of that is that it was done behind, or much of it seems to have been done behind the backs of the Israelis. The first thing is, as a goodwill gesture on the part of Hamas, they have agreed to release an American Israeli soldier to the Americans. And that was done apparently without the knowledge of Netanyahu. Further evidence that there is a real rift between Netanyahu and Trump. And then there's talks that he's pushing for a real ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, an end to the war, more than just a truce. And that clearly goes against the desires, the objectives of Netanyahu. So those rumors that we heard last week about Trump just being unable to stand Netanyahu and refusing to speak to him anymore, they appeared, there's accumulating evidence that those rumors were true.
How is Israel taking all this right now?
Well, Netanyahu is clearly just very nervous, and I've heard him describe that he and his administration as being losing their usual smugness, and that it seems to be gone. I think he's actually kind of scared. Now, as far as Israel in general goes, I've heard that 70% of the Israeli population supports the kind of deal that, in fact, Trump seems to be pushing for, to have all the hostages released and an end to the fighting. That's something that Netanyahu and his coalition members don't want. But this is a case where he actually can be in line with Israeli public opinion, and that gives him, more cards to play, more strength vis-a-vis Netanyahu.
And you're saying he wants a permanent ceasefire. Is that possible without having a two-state solution?
Well, that's an interesting question. There are obviously a lot of details that need to be worked out. And there's talk about, maybe having the territory, let's say, governed, or at least the reconstruction funded by the Gulf states. Apparently, the Gulf states are not interested. And then there's also the question of humanitarian relief. There seems to be some sort of deal in the offing right now where actually a U.S. kind of an NGO would take over distribution of humanitarian aid, food and medicine and so forth, in southern Gaza. Now, this, from what I understand, is being done together in coordination with the Israelis and would likely be just, actually a plan that supports Israeli ethnic cleansing in the north. We've seen indications going back months, actually before Trump's term, that the Israelis were planning to just clear all the Gazans out of the north. Eventually they probably want to get them all out of there, but the first stage of their ethnic cleansing plan is to push them out of the north into, the south. And so if this goes ahead, yeah, it could save many, hundreds of thousands of lives, but it would be part of an ethnic cleansing program. Again, it's just we're hearing rumors, but that may happen. There are a lot of things that are going on right now, and with the exception of, maybe that plan, it seems to be it's happening without or in opposition to Netanyahu.
Right? I don't want to get too hopeful, but it sounds like this rift really could be big. And if Trump really feels that Netanyahu is manipulating and he can be maybe Trump will be vindictive. And just, it sounds like that's what he's doing. He's talking to Hamas directly without the Israelis even knowing about it. That's how he brokered the deal for this American Israeli soldier that's been held captive there. He brokered the deal with the Houthis without Israel knowing. And they're moving forward with talks with Iran. I'm getting a bit more hopeful about that. It seems like we're seeing something maybe potentially similar that was happening with Trump team when they started talking with Russia. It's becoming an educational experience for them. They started hearing the Russian point of view, although we haven't seen enough change in policy regarding that. But it does seem like there's become an increasing awareness within Trump himself and Witkoff of the Russian side after speaking with them. And now we're seeing the same thing potentially happening here with the Trump administration, the axis of resistance. He's starting to understand their point of view and what they're doing, and that really Iran and the axis of resistance isn't necessarily the greatest threat to peace. It's Israel's continued just expansion, and they don't desire to have a ceasefire or to release the hostages. It's about ethnic cleansing, and I hope that Trump is starting to realize that. Do you think so?
Well, as far as I can tell, first of all, there are no direct negotiations between Hamas and the U.S. Neither so far, anyway. I think that maybe is changing in the case of Iran. They've been working through intermediaries.
How would they have negotiated the release of that soldier? That
must have been... I think that it was through the Qataris is how they did it. Okay, so they didn't actually get together in a room and talk to each other. It seems, it's actually, it's what you said is potentially true, and maybe there's some, maybe that's already happening. What seems to be definitely true is that he's come to realize that at least Netanyahu and his government, is constantly lying to him and is actually trying to sabotage, various efforts of his. And that's what I hear, that's what infuriates him. It's just that he assumed that, okay, well, we're all on the same page here. Whether we're talking about a ceasefire with Hamas or, maybe a deal working out a deal with the Israelis, or not with the Israelis, but the Iranians. But no, what he's found is that he's been, Netanyahu's been working behind his back, and then had no intention, for example, of actually achieving any meaningful ceasefire with Hamas. He had been told that, but then he just found through experience that the guy just lies to him. And of course, he's been lying to everybody. He lied all the time to Biden and to previous presidents. Netanyahu's been lying to U.S. presidents for decades. But those previous presidents saw it as their duty, just to really cover up for the Israelis. Let's say we can go all the way back to the USS Liberty. That's an extreme case, but it's just another example of U.S. president, covering the Israeli nefariousness. In that case, it was an attempt to actually sink a U.S. ship. But here it's obvious attempts to sabotage the work of a U.S. president. And very much to his credit, Trump seems to be the first president who says, no, I'm not, this is crazy. I'm not putting up with this. This guy, I'm not listening to him. And at least, for the last couple of weeks, it shows he seems to be serious about it. I mean, he seems to be truly infuriated and just set on, working out his own deals, which is a huge breakthrough. Of course, we just haven't seen it in the past. People like Biden, it's funny, you think, well, Biden would end up, a lot of people, maybe some people voted for him saying that, okay, he's terrible, but he's a Democrat and is going to be a little bit more sympathetic to the Palestinians than Trump and the Republicans. And on the surface, that's the way it looks. But there's a strange dynamic here at play, and that is that, which we've seen before in other contexts. It's just that the Democratic presidents are terrified of being accused of being, insufficiently supportive of Israel. And so they often overcorrect. Now, Trump, as we said, he's got that reputation for being a Zionist hardliner, a well-deserved reputation, I may add. But that actually strengthens his position. It allows him to ignore Netanyahu, actually to go directly against his wishes. And he doesn't worry because nobody's going to pretend that Trump is somehow soft, on the Palestinians. So, that's part of what we're seeing here. And it's, potentially, it may not go, it may be just a fit that he has for a month and then we'll all be back to where we were before. But potentially, there could be a real breakthrough. That's what at least we have reason to hope through, based on somebody said it was like a benefit of Trump's narcissism. This guy was insufficiently respectful to him, and therefore, he's decided to ignore him, and more than that, maybe tear him down. Um, I think that's actually not a fair comment in this case. I think it's just that Trump has self-respect, and that's what previous presidents were lacking. And I think it is to his credit that, again, that he is going directly against Netanyahu.
How hopeful are you? I want to be. I am feeling hopeful, but I've gone through this
Yeah,
process so many
yes,
times,
right,
So
right,
like,
yeah. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I think we may, at least in the short run, get a ceasefire. Again, because of the emotional state that Trump is in right now. And the fact, again, that the Israeli public wants this. Actually, this has been unpopular in Israel, the policy of Netanyahu vis-a-vis Gaza. Um, but again, Netanyahu's got his back against the wall. He has to go ahead with his plans of ethnic cleansing and in Gaza. Yeah, otherwise, his coalition is going to fall apart. And a real ceasefire, something that's really going to last, is something that they're not going to stand for. Again, they put up with a temporary ceasefire. Now, I believe Ben Gvir actually resigned during the first ceasefire, but then he came back. And if there's another ceasefire, maybe Netanyahu can, like what happened the first time. You say, hey, this is temporary. We promised to do these things. We won't keep our promises. And we were reporting those rumors back then. They turned out to be correct. And maybe that's what will happen this time. Is that, I think it's fair when you're talking about Netanyahu, you should be very cynical. If he agrees to a ceasefire, just don't put too much weight on that, anything that he says about it. I think we'll start hearing rumors again that he's going to break it soon. He just wants to get a few more hostages out. So I would think that any deal that's worked out that Hamas, agrees to is going to understands this about Netanyahu, is going to try to get some sort of meaningful guarantee, to prevent that from happening. But it remains to be seen. Again, Hamas is in a very, very weak position. Yeah, but maybe they really see their hope. I think they probably do, is with the Americans and with Trump. They know that Netanyahu just wants to kill them all. I think they know that, and that any deal that depends on Netanyahu's word is not worth the paper that it's written on. But maybe they can take advantage of Trump's change of attitude and achieve some sort of meaningful agreement. I mean, there's reason, to be somewhat hopeful, but it's just like anything that involves Trump is, you just always have to add that proviso. We've seen him flip-flop before. That's true. But, maybe this is going to be a permanent breakthrough. We can always hope for it. It just maybe he can only be crossed so many times before he just, decides to just put somebody in the doghouse forever.
right. I mean, so what we're hearing is that Trump has completely cut off communication with Netanyahu. And if those rumors are true, then that's a huge, huge rift. It shows that maybe he really is throwing Netanyahu under the bus. He's had it with this guy. Yeah, so I don't know. It's exciting, and now they're going on this. He's going on a tour of the Middle East, visiting all these Gulf monarchies, and Israel is not on that list. He's not even stopping by Israel.
Right.
How significant is that?
Well, yeah, it's significant. And I think also, I believe it was Hegseth was going to visit Israel, and he canceled his trip to Israel. So it is significant.
Right.
I mean, there's,
So
one or two things you say, who knows? Maybe Hegseth got a cold or something like I have right now. But, but yeah, there's accumulating evidence of a real rift. I think we have to believe in it now.
Okay. Okay. Well, if this rift is real and then a ceasefire does get brokered with Trump's help and Netanyahu knows he can't have the ceasefire or else he loses his coalition, so he has to break and continue it. But if he breaks it, doesn't that just further widen that rift that Trump is like, no more. No, we're done, you know?
Uh-huh. Potentially, yeah. Of course, Netanyahu broke the first ceasefire that had been brokered by Witkoff, representing Trump. But that clearly was done with the blessing of Trump. Yeah, and let's not forget that. But this time, perhaps Trump is going to say, really lay down the law and say that, okay, look, we're serious about the ceasefire. If you go ahead and break it, this is not with my blessing, and there will be hell to pay. And I think where Netanyahu had no fear of previous presidents, he does seem to be genuinely afraid of Trump. And again, for the reasons that I've laid out earlier.
I want to see Netanyahu scared and just see that smugness on his face all the time. He comes to our Congress and gives these speeches and smiles and gets all these ovations. It just led him to this sense of that I am the ruler of the United States. I can do what I want. And now it seems like, maybe he's gone too far and that hubris is caught up with him.
Maybe.
We'll see. I don't want to get too hopeful.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It's exciting,
Right.
for me.
Yeah. Again, there's Trump, and I think it's always a mistake to just put too much confidence in Trump. It's just that we saw him earlier, for example, refer to Zelensky as a dictator, and then a week later he walked it back. But this needs to be something more serious.
Right. But he never stopped talking to Zelensky completely.
Right.
There's
Right.
always
Yeah, it
this
is more
seems
serious. Right.
right. Or maybe, who knows, this Qatari jet, maybe that's what changed Trump's mind. He's like $400 million flying palace. And then Netanyahu comes back with a $600 million jet. He's like, all right, Israel, you're okay, my book again. What do you think of that jet story, that luxury jet that was the Qataris are gifting to Trump?
Yeah. Well, I think they understand Trump. I think that's it. I mean, I think there's no question about it.
Right. So do you think that it is essentially, in a way, a bribe?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's supposed to serve as Air Force One, but then there's also, I've heard that Trump would take possession of it after, he retires from office.
Right. That's a bribe, right?
That's a bribe, right? If that is indeed is true, then that is a bribe. Yeah.
Is that an issue? Is this a big issue?
Well, it should be. I think it should be. It seems like a huge bribe, being paid right before our eyes. I think it should be made clear that this has to remain U.S. government property. I mean, otherwise, this is just, right, you're advertising your corruption.
Do you think that I guess there's almost a willingness for people to look the other way because people think, well, Israel's bribing all of our politicians all the time anyways, via AIPAC and these Israeli lobbies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it still shouldn't be, it's not okay. It doesn't excuse,
Right.
You can't be accepting bribery, but will that be, you think, a big problem for Trump going forward? This is going to be something that's going to be used, obviously, by the Zionist side to say, like, okay, well, the Qatar, it's just because Trump was bought off by the Qataris now.
Well, I'm sure that some of them will try to make that argument. I don't know if it'll be convincing because clearly the rift preceded the gift of the palatial 747.
Mm. So I've been seeing articles that it does sound like there is fear that within Israel that Trump may recognize a Palestinian state.
Mm.
Do you really think that that's on the table? And
all I can say is I've heard those rumors, but most of my sources, just media sources, I mean, find that doubtful. That's all I can say. But who knows?
I've been seeing reports that the Israelis, I forget, the foreign minister, I forget, but that Israel will take unilateral action against any country, clearly directing it at the United States that recognizes Palestine as a state. What does that mean? Taking unilateral action? What does that mean?
I don't know. I mean, I mean, other countries have done that in Europe, for example, and I can't think of any realistic. I mean, there's been heated protests. Maybe an ambassador was called back, that kind of thing. But other than that, I don't know what they could do.
Yeah, it seemed like it was clearly directed at the U.S., not really so much the rest of the world. Because
Right.
that's, I think that's Israel doesn't care so much. I mean, they do a
Yeah.
bit, obviously, but if a
Right.
country like Norway or Spain says that,
Right.
we're going to recognize Palestine,
Right. Well, I
they
think,
don't like it, but
yeah. Never forget that, of course, Israel has many, many very powerful assets within the U.S. And if they want to go to war with the administration, they could. Now, it's going to be a tough war again because Trump is Trump. And again, he's positioned himself, if anything, to the right of, not exactly to the right of the Zionists, but you know, with the extreme Zionists. Let's put it that way. Um, and normally, you would say the Israelis are going to win, but again, it's Trump. And then also, there is clearly a split among the Zionists in this country. And, I think it's mainly over the issue of the hostages and also of image. I think there are a lot of, lifelong Zionists who are deeply realize that actually, Israel's image has suffered terribly over the last year and 9 months. And they blame that on Netanyahu and his government. I And so, yeah, I think just to give you a very good example of that, there was a piece in the New York Times recently by Thomas Friedman, is one of these lifelong ardent Zionists. And he said it's just, essentially, yeah, Netanyahu has to go. Israel, has taken a wrong turn. It's, very, very surprising words from a person like Thomas Friedman. I think it echoes what we heard from Chuck Schumer, more than a year ago, that already there's a great deal of discomfort among American Zionists, especially Jewish Zionists, with the current administration. And so this is Zionism within the U.S. is divided. This provides a unique opportunity. You could say that it's been suffering the strains of the Gaza genocide. The people like Thomas Friedman, they haven't really come to terms with, they don't admit the horror of what has happened. They deny, the crimes of Zionism prior to October 7th. But it's just gotten so bad that they can't really deny that, that Israel has been conducting, if they wouldn't call it a genocidal war, but a very, very bloody war, and that it is making Israel look very, very bad. And it's out of really loyalty to Zionism on their part that they feel like Netanyahu has to go, and they have to get a new face there for Zionism in Israel. So again, this provides, this split within the U.S., this split within Israel does provide Trump with an opportunity. So maybe, even if Netanyahu goes after him, he may find that he doesn't have the power within the U.S. that he used to have. And again, this is a consequence of the Gaza onslaught, the Gaza genocide.
okay. So when you're talking about Israel has many assets within the United States, and Israel may try to use these assets to go to war with the Trump administration, if Trump recognizes a Palestinian state or pushes Netanyahu too far. Can you explain what you mean by these assets and how they would go to war with the administration?
Well, first of all, there's Congress. Everybody knows that just virtually every member of Congress is in the pocket of AIPAC. Sometimes AIPAC brags about it itself. So that's the most powerful weapon that they have right there. And AIPAC so far has remained aligned with Netanyahu and his government. They haven't, but they may, looking at the shifting landscape, who knows? They may decide that they're going to have to put some distance between themselves and Netanyahu. And then, of course, the media, mainstream media, is full of shills for Zionism. And so those are two very, very powerful forces right there. And then there are the mega donors on both sides of the aisle, for the Democrats and the Republicans. The majority of these, like the top 10 mega donors, are outright Zionists. So, again, you put this all together, and yeah, there's a formidable army. But again, if they are split, they may not be able to defend Netanyahu. There clearly are a certain number of them are already, have decided that Netanyahu must go.
Well, I hope this war happens. It shouldn't be so bloody. It's a war that needs to happen. And I feel like if this does happen, if the Israel uses its assets within the U.S. to take down Trump and the Trump administration, we are going to see it backfire magnificently on the Israelis. Because you're basically asking, all right, the members of Congress that are all bought off by AIPAC, just the fact that this is becoming more and more recognized, you see it on Twitter. People understand that AIPAC is buying our politicians. There's just more general awareness. And then these politicians are going to have a decision. Are they going to be siding with Trump, or are they going to side with AIPAC? And when they do side with AIPAC, it just becomes very, very apparent to everybody that, hey, you are an Israeli first person. You are not acting in the interest of the United States. You're a congressman elected to serve your district, your people in the United States. Why are you going against your own president of the United States, especially the Republican Congress members, and saying no, we're going to go to war with Iran or whatever it is that they keep on spouting, when clearly it becomes clear that this is just something that is, you're being manipulated by Israel or being bought off by Israel, and Trump is aware of that. And I think that's going to be a huge problem, right?
Yeah, right. I would just say that looking at the political landscape in this country, I think, again, Trump is particularly strongly positioned to win this war against Netanyahu. Because not only is there split, well, actually, most of the anti-Netanyahu Zionists are over on the Democratic side of the aisle. Again, we've already talked about Thomas Friedman and Chuck Schumer. Both of them ardent Zionists, Democrats, and now, have become aware of the need to get rid of Netanyahu and want to see him go, right? And this is what's happening on the Democratic side of the aisle. I think that, like, the support for Netanyahu and his coalition is much stronger on the Republican side of the aisle. But then you have Trump. And if Trump goes against it, full bore, a lot of that support is going to disappear. It's going to evaporate. And so you look at it, it just may be that, I think that if Trump decides to really go after Netanyahu, and that he'll win the fight. Now, the bigger question, though, unfortunately, he's not going to defeat Zionism. And those people on the other side of the aisle, they want a friendlier, more civilized face for Israel. But they're really not opposed to Israeli expansionism. They just maybe want it to slow down. That's the way things were before. Israel was expanding. It was seizing territory. It was, we know all the things that it was doing, and they never had a problem with it. And they just wanted to go slowly. And I think they would like to get it back on that slow track because they understand that these last 19 months have actually seriously damaged Israel's and Zionism's reputation.
So you think that's a possible outcome of this, that Netanyahu disappears and then we get a more, I don't know, liberal leader in Israel that is still Zionist, still believes in expansion, but is not for the genocide right now, saying that we have to pull out. Yeah, but can they even do that? I'm saying, like what's happened in Gaza has been so horrific. Mm-hmm. Once this stops and we start to clear out the rubble and just start covering families that are just been buried, tens of thousands, and we see the body count just continue to rise. Israel can't just pretend that it didn't happen. Right? They got to, there has to be some type of comeuppance, right? Of some kind. They have to, maybe will they be forced to say, like, we messed up and we do have to recognize a Palestinian state, or that's just impossible within Israel. It's like,
Yeah, I think in the present time it is. Again, I follow the leftist Israeli press actually quite closely, and with very few exceptions, very few honorable exceptions, you don't see that. There really is no willingness to recognize a Palestinian state, and on a lot of these big issues, they're really in line with Netanyahu. They're not against bombing Iran or any of the other things. So it's I don't see that. There would have to be. This is a step in the right direction, but we're a long ways from having an honest reassessment of Zionism. I think the way that liberal Zionists are dealing with it now, it's just that we got a bad guy in there, we got to push him out, and then our wonderful Zionism can proceed as before.
okay, there are different things that I'm hoping will come out of this, and some of them maybe are too unrealistic and just pie in the sky type of hopes. But is there a chance you think that AIPAC would be forced to register as a foreign agent during this administration? That it could go that far? That he'd be that upset that, hey, you put all these people in our government that are manipulating me. You put Mike Waltz right in here as my security advisor and was pushing me constantly to go to war with Iran. You pushed me constantly to bomb the Houthis, even though it's something that I really never wanted to do, but you told me that it was the right thing to do over and over again. And I found out that you were doing it with a direct link on orders from Netanyahu. This is treason. That should piss him off so much. And I think it has, but
Right.
I want to see how far it goes.
Yeah, it's not impossible. It would be a very tough fight. But because AIPAC still just has tremendous power within Congress on both sides of the aisle. But I don't think we're going to be able to defeat AIPAC now. But AIPAC may, to save its own skin, have to put a little bit of distance between itself and Netanyahu. Maybe they've already done it. I'm not aware of it. Yeah, it's going to be rough. But if, for example, AIPAC clearly aligns itself with Netanyahu against Trump, that might make them a target of Trump's ire, and maybe there will be a real attempt to have them registered. I think that would be a particularly tough fight, but who knows? Maybe we're in a new era. I hope so. I don't know.
I feel like it's fertile ground to take on something like AIPAC now. And why would the fight be so tough? What would the argument that AIPAC make? This is just clearly the right thing to do. Any other country would have to register as a foreign agent. Why wouldn't Israel? There's no argument to be made against it. Is there?
Well, it doesn't matter. There's no rational, well-founded argument, but they have rejected every move to register them ever since the early 1960s, and quite successfully. And then just remember, AIPAC is not Netanyahu. They obviously have closely aligned themselves with Netanyahu, but they're not Netanyahu. So if you're going after AIPAC, it's harder to say it's just this one guy this bum that we have to throw out. It is more of a direct attack on Zionism, and I think you're going to find a lot of people, especially if it's a fight between Trump and AIPAC, that some of those anti-Netanyahu Zionists like Chuck Schumer and Thomas Friedman might actually rush to the defense of AIPAC.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
I hope he has the stomach to try to do something like that. I think that it would be.
I mean, even if it fails, it would be good. Somebody tried, and then it'll bring this fact to the attention of a lot of people, including especially certain kinds of Republicans that were maybe previously unwilling to consider the possibility that AIPAC may not be the most patriotic organization, American patriotic organization.
Right. I mean, that should be so clear to everybody. But that's just the one thing that just gives me hope now, is that I'm just seeing more and more people on both sides of the political spectrum saying like, hey, this is messed up. Why does Israel have so much control over our country? Why are we passing laws that are saying that you can't criticize Israel, or attempting to? Why are we deporting people that are here legally on visas that went through this process to study, but they are not happy with what's going on in Gaza, which pretty much most of the whole world is has this opinion and will deport you. You know, these types of laws. I think people are realizing like what is going on, and I think there's so many things that we can be watching as this develops with Trump and how his relationship with Israel and Netanyahu play out. But if we see kind of maybe a general easing up on this crackdown on so-called anti-Semitism, it might show that maybe the AIPAC is losing control of the Trump administration, because those are policies that go directly against kind of things that Trump's base was supportive of. This idea of free speech, you know, not having protected classes. That was a big thing. And now I think there's a lot of, you know, it doesn't,
right.
Doesn't fit.
Yeah, I'm not sure about his base. I think, you know, unfortunately, most of the base, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Democratic base or whatever. They're not really that. Wait a second, did I lose you?
You did. Okay. All right. Okay. So we're back. Little blackout. Anyways, we can move on. You were just saying that, you know, there's some updates, and I saw as well regarding the tariffs in China,
Right.
that Trump is negotiating. We have a deal. There's a pause. I can still shop at Walmart and everything should be okay.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, we should be aware of where we were. We were on, or maybe still are on the verge of an economic disaster. You know, the tariffs went into effect some weeks ago, but of course it takes some time for, you know, the goods to move through the pipeline, you know, to cross the Pacific, for example, and you know, to be offloaded at the ports and so on and so forth. And that, you could think of it as, you know, a wave. That wave finally hit on the West Coast, and there were reports coming out that the number of containers arriving at these ports had dropped drastically. And actually, dock workers were being laid off, or, you know, are told not to come to work because there's nothing to do. Truck drivers didn't have any containers to haul. And that, you know, so that was something that had been predicted. It was supposed to, you know, that first wave was supposed to hit about there on the West Coast, and then a week or so later on the East Coast, you know, of course, because we're farther away on the East Coast from China. And then I think we probably would have still a couple more weeks at least, because a big inventory was built up in anticipation of this interruption in supply. But by June, definitely, you know, we were going to see empty shelves. And I think you can just imagine the anger, including among Trump supporters, you say, what the heck? You know, I went to Walmart to get my favorite or whatever, you know, my fishing rod for the summer, and it was gone. There was nothing there. The whole aisle was empty. There's going to be fury. And so clearly the Americans were under a lot of pressure. I really don't think the Chinese were under pressure. The Trump administration is trying to pretend that it was that Xi Jinping called him. The Chinese deny it and they said last week that they began talks at the request of the Americans last week in Switzerland. And then we had just yesterday a statement that at least a temporary agreement was reached. And I was looking at it, you know, some of there was a part of the contract or the agreement was published. And according to my understanding of it, it's basically all but 10% of the tariffs that were imposed since the start of the tariff war are going to be canceled, and on both sides. So we're just going back to 10% of all of that on both sides. And that, you'd have to say, is clearly a victory for the Chinese. I mean, it certainly looks like Trump has abandoned his tariff war, and he imposed even higher tariffs on goods than the Chinese imposed on American goods, and yet they're both going back to 10%, if I read it correctly. Now they're supposed to work out, you know, further details and maybe address some other issues over the coming weeks and months. I think this is good for 90 days, and then it's supposed to be, you know, maybe made permanent and expanded after 90 days. again, it doesn't surprise me. I think like Trump went into this really not understanding what he was doing, like he often does. Again, I think, maybe some of his instincts are correct, but you have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand, economics. And he clearly didn't. And he just started slapping these on. And he also had the supreme confidence that China would cave in, and China did not. Because China understood, I think was prepared for this, and China is just no longer dependent on the U.S. The way it once was. Approximately 14% of its exports go to the U.S., and it has a huge, that's not 14% of its economy. It's maybe 2% of its economy, because of course it has a huge domestic market, which is actually in many ways undeveloped. And so there's something, okay, maybe we could take a 2% hit, but it's something that they can live with. But I don't think the U.S. is so dependent on so many Chinese exports that we really couldn't do without Chinese goods. And I think the Americans were seeing that in spite of all their tough talk and Trump's bluster.
Okay, so should we view this as great news for the United States?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, especially I think it was done just in the nick of time. You can start to get new goods into the pipeline. And so we may see some interruptions. It'll take a while to get the new goods, packed and loaded on the ships and so on and so forth. But I think by and large, we're not going to see the empty aisles. And yeah, I think the whole thing was very stupid, but if you do something stupid, the best thing to do is just well, he's not going to admit it, but to go back to where you were before. And that's what we've done so far. We'll see. Maybe there's some sort of concession that he'll get out of China, but I think that China will probably get some concessions from us.
Maybe this is just a good thing in the larger picture in terms that the U.S. is recognizing the strength of China and allowing us to potentially gracefully enter a multipolar world instead of this constant rhetoric of we've got to prepare for the fight against China. If we realize that we can't even engage in a tariff war,
right?
What makes us think that we would be able to handle a real war?
Right. Well, because of course, in the case of a real war, you would have the same consequences. Goods would stop. Most likely, anyway, would stop flowing to the U.S. And if we couldn't handle that, without the military conflict, if you're going to put a military conflict on top of the economic conflict, I don't think it's something that we can bear.
Right. So hopefully, out of all this madness that Trump is doing, just this chaotic approach, hopefully he's just gathering information about how the world really works, and it could lead us to avoid some type of disaster that the U.S. realizes that it can't be the global hegemon, and it has powerful players that it needs to treat with respect and interact with, because we're trying the approach of smacking everybody down. You get a tariff, you get bombed, and it's not working. It's not working at all. It's backfiring incredibly, and it's a painful lesson, but hopefully Trump can learn it. Do you think that's possible?
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, I was listening to Trita Parsi, an Iranian who often who comments on Middle Eastern affairs, especially those that are related to Iran. And he said that he's no fan of Trump's, but he says to Trump's credit, he unlike previous presidents, didn't double down on his mistake. He was talking about the Houthis. He actually just said, "Oh, this isn't working," and he walked away from it. And that's to his credit. It was a dumb thing to do, but without actually admitting it was a dumb thing to do, substantively he did. He just said, "Okay, yeah, let's stop this. Let's do something else." So yeah, maybe that's you'll never get Trump to admit that he wasn't awesome and that he did that the Chinese didn't come begging to him or whatever, but he knows it didn't work. And I think that's going to make him reluctant to pursue aggressive policies vis-a-vis China in the future.
Okay, I hope so. Let's move over to Ukraine just to wrap things up. So we had the Victory Day parade. It seemed like a great success for Russia, lots of world leaders. And then there was this demand of a 30-day ceasefire from Zelensky saying, let's engage into this. And then it seemed like Putin replied, like, well, let's just go straight and solve this once for all. Let's no preconditioned talks. Let's go back to Istanbul. Nothing to say like, these are deal breakers. Let's just start here and we can finish it. Is that what's happening? Like, can you
Yeah.
explain the
Okay.
situation?
Well, it was done in very dramatic fashion. It was, I believe it was, no, it wasn't last night. It was the previous night or the early hours of, Sunday morning that Putin held a press conference. I think it was approximately 2 in the morning. I'm amazed by the guy. It's just like if I were president and said, like, I've done too much. I'm sorry. Let me go to sleep tonight. And he had an incredibly busy schedule over the course of the Victory Day celebrations. He met with dozens of leaders. Sometimes, in the case of Xi Jinping, it was 7 hours. It was just talks and, one after another. But I think he saw the need to counter that 30-day ceasefire ultimatum, because that's really what it was. It was something that Ukraine did in coordination with the Europeans and apparently with the Americans, but then maybe not. We'll talk about that later. So if you remember, it was Starmer, Macron, Tusk of Poland, and also the new chancellor from Germany. What,
Mertz.
Mertz. Yeah, I was going to say Gertz, but I knew that was wrong. Mertz. They all took the train to Kiev and met with Zelensky, and they worked out the way they were going to present this ultimatum, because essentially, okay, 30 days immediately, no preconditions whatsoever, or yeah. None of this talk about monitoring and working out some sort of, the details of the ceasefire. We're just going to declare a ceasefire, and Russia has to agree to it, or else we're going to we're going to supply more weapons than ever to Ukraine, and we're going to slap new sanctions on Russia. And so it was going to be, the idea was, I think that I doubt that they thought the Russians were actually going to cave in. But they thought that maybe they can make them look bad, make them look like they're the warmongers. We want peace, and the Russians clearly want war. Now, of course, the Russians have explained, they made it clear, many times, especially I think it was back on March 18th, that Putin said in a conversation with Trump, explained that, look, okay, yeah, I'm not opposed to a ceasefire in principle, but to have a ceasefire that works, we do have to figure out how it's monitored, how violations are dealt with and so on. And then what he was saying is true. And, sort of that's common sense. That's been the experience in past conflicts. You do need to do that. You just declare a ceasefire. The chances are that 99 out of 100, the thing's going to break down. But then also he said that, okay, and during the ceasefire, you can't continue to supply arms to Ukraine. Because we know the reason that they're agreeing to the ceasefire now is that they're losing. And actually their situation is becoming increasingly desperate. And I would add that they probably are aware of an upcoming offensive by the Russians. And they would love to put a halt to that, So it's all to the advantage of the Ukrainians. And they say, okay, we get a rest. We prevent the Russians from launching their offensive. We get to rearm. And then we'll be in a stronger position than ever. But the Russians are not going to do this. They've seen this happen before. It happened prior to the Minsk agreements. It was actually, it wasn't really the Russians back then, though the Russians provided support. It was the Donbass militia had the Ukrainian army surrounded in eastern Ukraine. And it was looking really bad for the Ukrainians. Chancellor Merkel rushed over to Moscow and, begged for a ceasefire, and then which led to the Minsk Accords, as we know. And in both cases, it turned out the ceasefire and the subsequent Minsk Accords were just a way of buying time for the Kiev regime. And, they never actually implemented the Minsk Accords, as we know. They never had any attention, as Poroshenko, Hollande, and Merkel herself said. But they used that time to rearm the Kiev regime, the Ukrainian armed forces. So anyway, the Russians know what's happened. They got burned once. If it hadn't happened before, maybe Putin would agree to it. He showed a willingness to trust the other side in the past, but he has become much more cynical, and I think rightly so. So he said, no, we have these conditions. We're going to have a ceasefire. But, he had said earlier, we are willing to conduct negotiations, without any kind of preconditions. We get together and we can start negotiating. And so what he did with this conference is he countered that kind of PR move on the part of the West at 2 a.m. in the morning, immediately after the West had made, introduced their proposal with all this fanfare. He offered a counter proposal. And what it is that, look, let's just go negotiate. We were doing that before, back in March of 2022. And then, of course, Kiev walked away from it. We were in Istanbul. Let's go back to Istanbul and continue. And, again, we'll hash it all out. This is what we did have an agreement, a draft agreement back then. We can produce a new one. So and so this, I think, was, this has always been the Russian position, but it was also really a very effective kind of counter move in the propaganda war. So instead of looking like, okay, the Russians just want war, they're not interested in peace. They're not offering a path to peace. Well, he is offering a path to peace. And and I think he did so very effectively.
How is Ukraine going to respond to that?
Well, they've already rejected it. But then Zelensky said that he'll go to Istanbul and, to meet Putin. He'll be waiting for him there. And so, you see that headline and you think, oh, does that mean that he actually agreed to Putin's offer? No. Actually, if you read the words carefully, I think there's some deliberate ambiguity, but he is still rejecting any negotiations because, again, he's sticking with the Western proposal that it will have a ceasefire and then negotiations. So what he's saying is that I'm assuming that you're going to have a ceasefire and then I can meet you in Istanbul. But that's not what the Russians have offered. And then, as others have pointed out, look, Putin's not going to Istanbul. Like when the Istanbul agreement was reached, it wasn't Putin there in Istanbul. It was his negotiation team. So I don't know why Zelensky would go there anyway. They've already rejected it.
Okay, so this move by the Western powers with this 30-day ceasefire proposal, you think was just basically Putin's response to it by saying, let's go back to the Istanbul talks, no preconditions, negotiate, completely kind of annulled that attempt, that PR attempt for the Ukrainian side to get a ceasefire, try to get a ceasefire, and if they don't, continue to give more ammunition, propaganda to vilify the Russian war machine and say, like, look, they don't want any peace. So you think that that's basically what happened?
Yeah, and it seems to have been effective. I mean, of course, the West is always going to, and its media propaganda machine is always going to try to, to give the most negative spin possible to anything that Putin does. But I imagine that even so, he's managed to muddy the waters somewhat. This clear propaganda victory has been tarnished, on the Western side. And for most of the rest of the world is looking at it and say, hey, yeah, the Russians have a plan. And I think it was very, very successful then. And then interestingly, apparently succeeded with Trump himself. Because Trump had signed up and said, okay, Russians, yeah, you got to agree to a ceasefire. He seemed to be on board with the whole thing. And he assumed that, they coordinated. I think there was a call between Trump and the assembled leaders in Kiev. And so it looked like, okay, at least the Western leaders thought that they were all on the same page and they were going to go ahead with this. But the minute that, or not the minute, but shortly after Putin, presented his counter proposal, Trump said, hey, Kiev, yeah, now we got a plan, go to Istanbul. And So
Trump and his ever-changing mind.
yeah,
It's
it's just like they always say. A lot of people say it's like the last person to talk to him is, if you want to know what he's thinking, just find out who he talked to 20 minutes ago. And so, like, he heard Putin and say, "Hey, that makes sense," So yeah, you'd have to say Putin's press conference was very successful.
Do you think that we're seeing something a little bit different coming out of Russia now in terms of when the SMO was first launched? You said that Russia did just a terrible job explaining itself. Nobody understood really what the goal was. They wanted with a smaller force, but then we later found out that it was to try to force some type of negotiated settlement,
Right.
which was the Istanbul talks.
Right.
But now what we're seeing potentially now is that maybe Russia is beginning to engage in the PR war a little bit more. And perhaps it's because the Western propaganda machine just went full steam, that it actually damaged itself because Russia didn't engage in the PR war that much. They weren't trying to pump it out. Instead, you had the Western side just go nuts with it and call anybody that tried to explain the Russian position that as Russian propagandists. People in the West, where people are just trying to figure out, because it didn't look like Russia was trying to put its story out, because it would immediately be, like, here's Russian propaganda coming out of Russia. But now that maybe the Western propaganda machine has been exposed to such a large extent, Russia has built up its reputation of being a cool, rational actor and not engaging in this propaganda war, that it actually is able to now, to some extent, it's able to start to, like, okay, we're going to be very careful and put out our positions more forcefully now.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing. It's like, oh, yeah, maybe these guys are getting better at this, and they do it in their own way. It's Putin, so it's not, it's not just rhetoric. It's not just a bunch of cliches. It is substantive. It is real, but he understood the need to get that out there forcefully, clearly, and quickly, and he did it. And I didn't see that in the past. So yeah, I think they've learned the importance of the information war, and they're going to fight it. They'll fight it in their own way. But it looks like, I think it probably took the Western leaders by surprise. They're used to being able to completely control the narrative, and this time the narrative got kind of lost control of it pretty quickly, especially with Trump's comments.
With the Western media just always covering for Ukraine and vilifying Russia, how do they counter the narrative? Is it just mostly through social media? I mean, how do we know that this was a really successful counter by Putin?
Well, I mean, this has been reported in more than one place, and I think there is some. Even I haven't read the Western reports, but I've just seen some headlines. But it sounds like even Western media kind of recognize that Putin was very effective in this, and have grudgingly shown him some respect. But in general, yeah, of course, if you're in the West, the best sources are social media, because that's just not controlled in the way that the mainstream media is.
So you don't think we're going to see the Ukrainians go to Istanbul and take up Putin's offer to try to end this?
No, it seems clear to me that that they have rejected his offer, which is to say, hey, no ceasefire now. Let's talk, and maybe that can lead to a ceasefire. If we make progress, then we can have a ceasefire. They rejected that, so I don't see them going. If they go, it's just it's pure PR, not based on anything, and based on a lie, essentially. If they try to do that.
So we're going to just probably see Russia continue to move forward, probably engage in some type of a major offensive, you think, in the next month or so?
There's just a lot of talk. We know that they have, hundreds of thousands of well-equipped soldiers in reserve, that have not been, that are back there. And it's hard to believe that they're not going to be enter the fight at some point pretty soon.
Do you think all the Western leaders in Europe are they all on cocaine?
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. That's all I would say. Of course, you're talking about that incident. There was some sort of mysterious white object on the table, and
that Macron took away. I mean, I'm sure many people saw it. It's very suspicious, and Merz covered up a little cocaine. I don't know what else you'd be using a little spoon like that for. So I don't know. To me, it wouldn't surprise me at all, and it would make it actually helps explain a lot.
Uh-huh.
We keep on asking like, what are these Europeans thinking? Like, there's
Yeah.
no rationality. It's like, oh, okay, they're all on cocaine. Then now it makes sense. Because they're a bunch of chihuahuas, but if you're on coke, they think they're lions, and they think they
Right.
can, and they get together and they're all doing coke together, and they're like, yeah, we can do this and this and this. It's like,
Yeah.
that's just the cocaine talking, guys. This isn't the anything sane, nothing rational. I honestly, I think that could be true, and if that is true, that's scary. That's scary. You don't want a bunch of coke heads trying to deal with the world's largest nuclear power, and they're saying we're going to take them down.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
that's a no-no.
yeah, right. Well, if they're, I don't know. Yeah, you may well be right. But even if they're not cokeheads, they clearly are unhinged and just, yeah, completely divorced from reality. So it is scary as it is. Whatever the cause of their unhinging, um, yeah, we ought to be very, very scared with these people in power.
Do you think this incident? I mean, it's further going to damage their image. Macron, Merz, Starmer. Do you think that we could see these guys get out of office? I mean, I feel like Macron's been there for a long
Yeah.
time. Merz just came in. Starmer's pretty new. Like,
Yeah, well, they're very, very unpopular. I mean, I've heard that, I don't know what the average approval rating for them is, probably in the teens or something. I mean, that very well may be true. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's um, just recently, for example, Starmer's party suffered a historic loss in local elections. And, not only was his party roundly defeated, but his own party has begun to rebel against him. They had been loyal, through thick and thin, but they saw him, suffer this major defeat. He had no explanation, no plans to do better in the next election, and he goes off to Ukraine. And so there's now direct criticism of him, for his Ukraine support. He does seem to be more interested in Ukraine than he is in this country, in the UK. And similar, we see similar things happening in both France and in Germany. These are very unpopular leaders. And all of them, they got office through, let's say, dubious means. They attained their office or retained their office through dubious means.
hopefully we have a cleaning house. I feel like there's just a great awakening happening across all of the Western world. People are starting to realize something's fishy. In Europe, it's more like they're Ukraine firsters. In the United States, it's more Israel firsters. Is the issue.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, we have a ways to go, but clearly let's say the narrative is fraying at the edges. It's
yeah,
still dominant, but it's fraying at the edges.
I know I need to temper expectations because Trump does this to me every couple of
Yeah.
months. Gives me hope, and then I'm like, what? And then he completely backtracks on
Yeah,
it. So
right.
I don't know, but I
Right.
guess I'm just so desperate for hope that I'm
Right.
just latching onto it.
Yeah.
It's just
Okay, well, what else can you do sometimes? But
yeah.
yeah, well, but we may, again, Trump's flip-flopping is infuriating. It's a lot of things, but there is an encouraging side. It is the opposite of the usual doubling down. And then it is good that he flip-flops on some of his more stupid ideas, like the tariff war or the bombing of the Houthis. And so maybe we should applaud that, and maybe again we'll see it with Iran. It's unclear what's going on right now. But the Israelis fear, and Netanyahu seems to fear, that he actually does want to make a deal. And I think he can, and all these, definitely in the case of the Houthis, Iran, the tariffs, these are deals that can be made. Yeah, you could say that in each case, the reason they can be made is that Trump himself kind of created the problem, right? He decided to start bombing the Houthis. And, well, that didn't work, so he stops bombing. That's something you can do, right? He has control over that. Or in the case of Iran and the JCPOA, well, he tore up the first one. Well, okay, it was done. We can have a second one that, will be slightly different, and then he can proclaim victory. But yeah, he created the problem there, and he can walk it back. So, again, that's what we're seeing. The one agreement that I don't think he can reach is, again, in Russia. It's because that's not something that he really created. It's not just like he's cleaning up his own mess. That's something much bigger. And the two sides are really so far apart that I don't think any agreement at this point is possible. But the other ones we may, I think we have reason to be hopeful on the tariff front, and with regard to Iran. We also have reason to be, especially in the case of Iran, and to be nervous. And the reason is that, okay, he still has all these Iran hawks around him. There is this very powerful faction within his government that's always been there, that preceded his administration, that is for war with Iran. They're there. They're always looking for a way to subvert an agreement and to push the U.S. into war with Iran. Now, in the case of the tariffs, I don't think that faction exists. You may find a couple of individuals, but there just isn't a faction that is for an all-out tariff war with China. So I think he can make an agreement, without really any resistance within his own administration or, anywhere else in the country. So I think we should be fairly confident. And again, with Trump, you can't be completely confident. Who knows? But I think that he's recognized that didn't work. And instead of doubling down, he's chosen to just give up on it and proclaim victory.
Yeah, let's see how this week pans out. I think this will be a very interesting week with Trump visiting all these Gulf states in the Middle East. And maybe there'll be something big that comes out of it. And if there is, encouraging signs, positive signs on the Iran deal, potential, I don't know, who knows, we really hope for a Palestinian state announcement. I just think it's important for people not to be so hyper-partisan. There's so much visceral hatred towards Trump. When he does horrible things like bombs the Houthis and it gives more and more military aid to Israel, he needs to be condemned. But if he is able to do something positive, we need to put aside our hyperpartisanship and realize that, okay, this is a good thing. This is good for the Palestinian people. This is good for peace in the Middle East, peace for the world. This is good for America. It's good for the whole world. If we can do this. So we don't. I think so many people get caught up in just rooting against Trump, and they kind of lose the bigger picture. Just let's
and they
think
end up
about
actually sacrificing principles that used to be sacred to them just because now Trump's embraced them. Well, I'm against them. That's something, unfortunately, that we see among hyperpartisans. You can't do that. If he does something right, praise him. And he, right now he's doing some things that are right, and we'll praise him. Yeah. And we just hope that he sticks with it.
That's the thing. That's the thing. We'll see. Okay. All right. Well, really interesting times, Dad. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about on Wednesday. You're off on your fishing trip, so enjoy your fishing.
Okay.
Okay. All right. See ya.
All right. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.